our Honourable Shashi Tharoor to give us his thoughts in allowing us to close the forum.
Your Excellency, Mr. Marwan Ahmed Al Sawale, Assistant Undersecretary, Ministry of Education of the UAE. Let's see now. There we are. My host, Sunny Varki, Founder, Chairman of GEMS Education, Moderator Dino Varki, Group CEO, the many distinguished participants in the audience, my young friends here as youth ambassadors for this forum, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I hope that covers everybody. I'm delighted to be present amongst you here today for the closing session of the Global Education and Skills Forum organized by GEMS Education in collaboration with the Ministry of Education of the UAE, UNESCO, and the Commonwealth Business Council. Though I understand many attendees have left, I'm glad that all of us here could find time to participate in this event and to enrich our understanding of a number of important issues through these deliberations. Policymakers, private education providers, international organizations such as UNESCO, which as a former UN official I know has always been in the forefront of endeavors to promote international cooperation in education, and other stakeholders must come together in a process of continuing and continuous dialogue if we are to successfully enhance institutional capacity at all levels of the education system. It's my belief that effective, scalable, and motivated and motivational education policies can result in the development of a nation by sowing the seeds of learning and skills in the young people by catching them young. Educational transformation is a global priority, and the big theme of your conference, collaboration through the PPP mode, especially in the use of information and communications technology in and for education, will be imperative for this transformation. This forum, I understand, has provided an important platform for discussing a number of important goals, the potential for public-private partnerships to enhance our ability to meet these goals, workforce and skill development, curricular reform for workplace relevance, the role of education in a knowledge society, the directions which higher education can explore, the effectiveness of corporate social responsibility initiatives in education, developing smarter content, pedagogy and delivery mechanisms through ICT, and the crucial issue of equity in access to education. I'm sorry that I've missed all of these discussions. I just flew in through the night and arrived this morning, but at least I was able to participate just now in a rather lively and enriching roundtable on the entire idea of global citizenship and whether we can educate young people for that. So I will return to that aspect of internationalism briefly at the end of my remarks. But rather than attempting to summarize the big themes of your conference beyond the topics that I've been able to list for you, I thought you might find it more useful if I shared with you my specific perspective as an Indian minister about the issues facing us in what is, after all, the second largest nation in the world as we confront education challenges in the environment that you've all been studying in the last couple of days. You see, India has to look at education through the prism of demography, because we are poised with an astonishing demographic reality. We are the youngest country in the world. We have 560 million people under the age of 25. If you just take the children of school and high school going age from 10 to 19, we have 225 million of them. Now, what does this mean in practice? Just purely looking at the demographic trends, it means that for the next 30 or 40 years, India could have, and one would argue should have, a youthful, productive, dynamic, working-age population at a time when the rest of the world, including China and Europe, the rest of the world is aging. That is, in fact, what the trends project. If you look at global United Nations figures for average ages, in the early 2020s, less than a decade from now, Europe will have an average age of about 46, the US will have an average age of about 40, Japan will be at 47, China will be heading towards 49, and India's will be 29. The International Labour Organization, the ILO, has concluded that in 2020, if you just look at the key working ages of 20 to 24, when people begin to enter the workforce, India will have 116 million young people at that age. China will only have 94 million. So suddenly, India is poised to become the workhorse of the world, to have a population that can absolutely help boom the Indian economy, as well as contribute to those economies which need younger labor forces, and those economies which need to purchase products from countries that have young labor forces. But all of this will only happen if we get one key thing right, and that is education and skill development training. If we get that right, we are poised to make a tremendous impact on the world, because the sheer numbers alone will guarantee that. If we get it wrong, however, if we fail to equip these young people through education and skill training to take advantage of the opportunities that the world of that second quarter of the 21st century will offer them, then we face the prospect of a humongous disaster. Because all of you know, I'm sure, that there is nothing more dangerous to any society than large numbers of unemployed, undereducated, or uneducated young men. I say men, though some women are equally inclined to react badly, but men in particular are prone to the blandishments of violence and terrorism, and this is a challenge we have already become aware of not so far from this part of the world. So for us in India, this is not just an education challenge. It is a demographic opportunity. It is not just a demographic opportunity. It is a national security obligation. If we don't get it right, we face disaster. If we get it right, we transform our society and, I believe, the world. So that is the vision with which I have approached my tasks as a relatively new Minister of State for Human Resource Development, which is a fancy way of saying education. What are we faced with as a country? Let me try and summarize the narrative of what we've done. It may have echoes in other developing countries, certainly formerly colonized countries, in 4 E's. The first E that we needed to focus on since independence in 1947 was the E of expansion. Why? Because the British, after 200 years of colonial rule, left us with 16% literacy. Our first census as an independent nation in 1951 showed we only had 17% literate people in our country, and only 8.5% of our women could read and write. A horrendous statistic. We have now taken that up 65 years later to 74%. And we are acutely conscious that isn't good enough. Because if 26% of 1.2 billion people don't know how to read and write, we have the world's largest population of illiterate people as well. So it's not a failure, it is an inadequate ratio of success, and we need to plug away at that. But look at the scale of the expansion challenge. We've gone from 30 universities at the time of independence to 670 universities today. We've gone from about 700 colleges to 35,000 colleges today. We've gone from 400,000 students in higher education to 20 million in higher education today. And we've been enrolling children in the school system. I'll come back to that in a minute. Expansion has been the name of the game in our country. The second E is that of equity, of access to education. Because the fact is that we are a society in which, and not just under the British, but before that as well, a number of people were excluded from educational opportunity. And we needed to include the excluded. We needed to try and ensure that people who were denied the opportunity of education by birth, whether because of gender or caste or religion or region or language, that they could come into it. And so that second E of equity, of promoting access, became a big issue for us. In fact, just 3.5 years ago, in 2009, our Parliament passed a Right to Education Act for school children, which ensures that it is now a matter of constitutional right for every Indian child to go to school. Every Indian child between the ages of 6 and 14 is entitled to 8 years of schooling by constitutional right. And that means if in the old days a kid wasn't in school, it was the parents' fault. Today, if a kid isn't in school, it is the state's fault. And that has created an enormous spur of enrollment. I think many of you being educational professionals know what a gross enrollment ratio is, a GER. The GER is a percentage of those in school against the estimate of the population at that particular age bracket. Well, we have done so well in enrolling children into our primary schools that our GER today in primary level is 111%. We've actually enrolled more children than we thought existed in that age group. And that has been actually a very significant transformation of the question of access to education in our country. Mind you, I don't want to sound complacent, because the next challenge of that has been that 111% by the time you get to the 8th grade drops to 69%, and by the time you get to the 11th and 12th grade, it drops to 39%. So a lot of people are not staying in the school system, which is a different issue, but I'll come back to that as well. So expansion and equity were understandably the major focuses of our educational policies for the first 6 decades after independence. In the process, I fear, we lost sight of an important third E, and that is the word excellence. The quality of education became secondary to the quantity of options available to our population. Again, as I said, this was understandable, but I'm afraid it wasn't good enough. So we have a situation in which some of our best institutions produce outstanding world-class graduates. But these institutions are islands floating on a sea of mediocrity. Today, the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology, to take just one example, have become such a brand name in America because so many of their products migrated to America in the 60s and 70s, founded companies in Silicon Valley, and helped spearhead the transformation of the computer revolution around the world, that the name IIT is now spoken of in California and Silicon Valley with the same reverence as MIT used to be. In fact, the respect for Indian scientific and engineering education has now grown out of all control, so that it's now become part of the new stereotype. You know, when I was a young student going abroad for the first time, the stereotype about Indians was either poor, emaciated people with begging bowls or half-naked fakirs lying on beds of nails. Today, the stereotype is that every Indian must be a software engineer or a computer geek. In fact, a friend of mine who, like me, did his honors degree in history, found himself being accosted at Schiphol Airport by a perspiring and anxiously perspiring European saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? Now, this transformation is a result of our education system, because when I went out to graduate school in 1975, I discovered that every single graduate of an IIT was guaranteed a scholarship somewhere in America. If you came first in your graduating class in IIT, you probably got a scholarship to MIT or Caltech. If you came at the bottom of your graduating class at the IIT, you got a scholarship to, I don't know, Rensselaer Polytechnic or the University of Oklahoma. But just getting into an IIT showed that your quality was higher than that of the average applicant to an American graduate school. That's the kind of reputation these institutions have. And there is a famous story of the founder of Infosys, Mr. Narayana Murthy, who was asked by an American television channel what his son was going to do, where he'd applied. And he said, well, my son has applied for the IITs, but I'm not sure he'll get in. And the interviewer said, so what do you think he'll do if he doesn't get into an IIT? And Mr. Narayana Murthy said, his safety is Harvard, he'll go to Harvard. And this created some astonishment in America. But the footnote to the story is that a few months after this interview, the son didn't make it to the IITs and got a full fellowship in Harvard. And the reason is, of course, that Harvard takes about 10 or 11% of all applications. The IITs take 0.01% after one of the most rigorous tests imaginable in the country. So you've got this unevenness. I went too long about IIT. I know that GEMS is much more in the school education space. But I mention this to draw the point that we have quality in the country, and yet it is rare. There are just a few institutions that produce that level of quality, and that once you get beyond them, you will speak to Indian employers who tell you that they are finding that the graduates they are hiring are essentially unfit to be hired, that they need remedial training. And I don't just mean on-the-job training, which any company today would do for a new recruit. big companies in India are actually educating their new hires for 6, 9, or even 12 months to make up for the deficiencies of what they have learned in their colleges. So Infosys in Mysore has a huge campus that looks like an American university campus and essentially functions like one. So employability is the fourth E. We must have an educational system that can employ people. And that doesn't just mean the IITs and the engineering institutions. It means that those who are not able, capable, or interested in going into those institutions should have a worthwhile available alternative. And that alternative must lie in vocational training. Because ours is a country where there is a crying need for this. For 3,000 years, our culture has been that if you wanted to be a cobbler or a carpenter, you'd better have a father or an uncle who's a cobbler or a carpenter because nobody else is going to teach you. Knowledge was transmitted through the family tree, through the gene pool. We need to get beyond that. We need to create a system in which people are able to offer instruction, that they are trained to do that, and that institutions are set up where somebody who doesn't have carpentry in his ancestry or doesn't have plumbing or masonry in his ancestry can still learn these trades, which will enable them to find work in India and abroad. It is said that today in India, a land of 1.2 billion people, there is a nationwide shortage of masons because so many of them have been hired by the construction industry in Dubai and in the UAE and the Middle East in general. That is unforgivable. There are lots of people waiting to be trained. We need to make this possible. But how do we catch them? We have concluded it's essential to catch them at the high school stage. We have decided that the vocationalization of high school education is not the same as dumbing down your high schools. It means offering that option. If we can now create enough children who have an opportunity to study vocational trades during their high school years, that they will then not necessarily join the long queue of people getting into third-rate colleges and institutions which will give them paper degrees that still leave them unemployable. Instead, they will go and learn useful skills, whether it's carpentry, plumbing, masonry, auto mechanics, welding, whatever it may be, that actually are skills in demand in India, outside India, and across the world, and will become even more in demand as those populations age and their available plumbers and welders and so on will become too old to work. They will need, again, labor from countries like India. So this is the vision. How do we get in this vocational professional training in our system? Whether it's in training institutions, whether it's in polytechnics, they first need children who've already been exposed to these opportunities in high school. And that's, again, an area we need to get involved in. We have now a Prime Minister's advisor on skill development, and it's actually from the private sector. We've been talking in this conference, I understand, about public-private partnership. There's an interesting approach. We are getting in the former chairman of the Tata Consultancy Services to lead a skill development effort in our country, and he is advising the Prime Minister, working with the National Skill Development Council and with schools and with our ministry in order to ensure that skilling becomes as much of a priority now as education. And public-private partnership has to be the way to go in this direction. Because who knows better what the marketplace needs than those who are active in the marketplace? We in government inevitably function with a different mentality. The processes of government are different from those of the private sector. But private sector institutions can tell you what are the skills you need, what kind of education do you need, what can you actually use as employers. And so we are now very consciously and deliberately promoting greater interface between academia and industry. At the university level, we're creating research clusters in some of our best universities where companies can come in and actually say to research professors at universities, let's work together. This is the kind of product we think has a market. Do you have bright PhD students or whatever who can work with you in helping research such and such application? Why not? We're not embarrassed about that. We'd like to see that kind of thing happening much more. In the polytechnics, we'd like to see much more interface. We'd like to see teachers in polytechnics actually working in real companies to keep their own skills up to date, to be familiar with new equipment, and to be able to actually come back and impart that to their students. And we'd like the students to have not just summer internships in real companies, we'd like the students of polytechnics to actually have as part of their education a real period of time, perhaps as much as a full year, inside a real job in a real firm, using their hands-on skills so they come out with a polytechnic degree that actually assures an employer they're worth hiring. This is the challenge we're taking on, and I'm very glad that this conference has given the kind of importance to PPP that we need to give, because to my mind, that is very much the way forward in this country. I'm sorry, in all countries. I did want to say a brief word about school education, because I know GEMS has focused its energies on school education. And in my country, one of the challenges we've had with school education, which actually came up also during the question and answer period at the round table a few minutes ago, is that too much of our educational culture in schools, and this may be a familiar problem to other countries around the world and in this region, too much of our education has concentrated on filling the children's heads with facts in order to be able to prepare for and pass an examination. That examination culture is deeply entrenched in India. As I said, I don't know if it applies elsewhere, it may well do. And so we have all this regurgitation and rote learning because the ultimate objective, the measure of a child's worth, has been seen for too long as the marks he or she gets in the examinations. Now, the problem, of course, with that is that you can prepare the questions for the examinations, but when you go out into the real world, the big examination called life asks you questions that you may not have prepared for. So what you really need out of a school education is not a child with a well-filled mind, but a child with a well-formed mind. A mind that is capable of dealing with the unfamiliar, of processing information for which that child is not prepared, a mind, in other words, that is capable of coping with the challenges of the 21st century globalized world, where so much that you haven't grown up with can come across you in whatever you do in your adult life. And a school that prepares a child to deal with unfamiliar facts, to synthesize them, analyze them, act on them, is a school that does far better by the child than a school that can boast having toppers in school leaving examinations, which has too often been the emphasis in India. One more thought that is worth mentioning in relation to the various things that you've all been discussing in your conference is indeed the importance of international cooperation. I see that just in the co-sponsors of your conference. International cooperation is a very important way forward. And I think one of the areas we should think about is increased use of ICT to promote international learning exchanges. My own government, I used to be in the foreign ministry a couple of years ago, my own government has created something called the Pan-African E-Network, which has today connected 41 African countries to each other through an Indian satellite. It has some benefits, including direct communication between heads of state of African countries, which didn't exist before. If you wanted to call from Lomé, Togo to Accra, Ghana next door, your lines actually used to go from Lomé to Paris, from Paris to London, from London back to Accra, made for a very expensive call. Today, the Indian satellite has made it possible for direct connections across many of these African countries. But beyond that, we are using the satellite to permit distance learning. So I was in Addis Ababa a couple of years ago, and I saw African students in the capital of Ethiopia in a classroom listening to a live lecture from an Indian medical professor in Chennai in India. And that kind of connection is also part of the way forward, where we can give strength to this whole notion of international cooperation by bringing some of the best educational possibilities through international video conferencing and ICT technology into the classrooms of people. Just as I understand President Clinton addressed you by video conference, we can have professors from the best schools and the best colleges doing, as part of their, if you like, international social responsibility, lectures for poor students in Africa, in the Middle East, in India, and giving them an opportunity to benefit from the learning and wisdom of these professors as well. Before I close, just a word of caution. Effective policies are useful only if they can result in implementable plans. And once again, therefore, I'd like to congratulate the organizers and stakeholders here today for having taken the initiative to create a forum for sharing of global best practices. Sunny Varki was telling me he wanted this to become the Davos of education. I'm looking forward to that prospect. Davos began in a much smaller scale than you have begun, and with already much less attendance. It was essentially a European forum for the first few years. You have already become much more global, much more international in your first outing. So I wish you luck in creating and building up this forum, sharing global best practices, and catalyzing an education transformation in all the countries engaged in this effort. I do hope the delegates to this event will go back with a newfound sense of purpose about the true potential for cooperative endeavors in this most crucial field of modern education. We are dealing with the most important material that the good Lord has given all of us, and that is the human child. Gabriela Mistral, the Nobel Prize-winning poet, famously said, "Of all the things that we can do wrong or bad in this life, the worst sin would be neglecting the child." To the child, we cannot say, "Wait till tomorrow." Her name is today. Let me leave you with that note of urgency, congratulate you on your efforts, and hope that this conference and its successors will continue to work for the uplift and the transformation of education around the world. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gents.